Hello students, today we are going to read the poem The Listeners written by Walter De La Mare. So let's talk about the poet first. A strong sense of wonder let Walter De La Mare write mysterious, ethereal poems and written stories that can give chills to both young and old. He was a poet of dusk. Born in Kent, the Garden of England, he grew up immersed in nature, but settled in London in 1890, where he worked in an office. A government pension in 1908 allowed him to write full-time, and in 1953 he was awarded the high honor of an Order of Merit. His 1923 anthology, Come Hither, a collection of rhymes and poems for the young of all ages, is a classic. Let me give you a brief introduction about the poem. Walter De La Mare published The Listeners in 1912 as the title poem of his second collection of poetry. It remains one of his most famous pieces of writing and reflects the author's fascination with mystery and the supernatural. The poem tells the story of an unnamed traveler approaching an abandoned house seemingly inhabited by ghosts, but leaves the reader with many questions unanswered. The text. "Is there anybody there?" said the traveler, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence chomped the grasses of the forest's ferny floor, and a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveler's head. And he smote upon the door a second time. "Is there anybody there?" he said, but no one descended to the traveler. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, where he stood perplexed and still. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men, stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall. Hearkening in an ear stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call, and he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved, cropping the dark turf 'neath the starred and leafy sky. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. "Tell them I came, and no one answered, that I kept my word," he said. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house. From the one man left awake, aye, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. The way it has been written is commendable. Now let us understand the poem. An unnamed figure, the traveler, knocks on the door of a house in the moonlight and asks if there is anyone inside. The traveler's horse grazes in the quiet forest while the traveler waits for a response. A bird flies out of a small tower on the house and over the traveler's head. The traveler knocks again, more forcefully, and repeats his question. No one comes down from the house to meet him. However, no one even leans out of the window, the sill of which is covered in leaves, to look at him. He stands in place, puzzled by the lack of an answer. Inside the house is a group of ghostly beings. These listeners stand in the moonlight as they listen to the human voice coming from outside. The ghostly beings crowd around the staircase onto which moonlight streaks, as the quiet atmosphere in the empty house is disturbed by the sound of the traveler's lonely voice. Outside, the traveler senses a strange presence in the silence that meets his question. His horse, undisturbed, continues to graze in the dark forest. The sky above full of stars and obscured by trees. The traveler suddenly beats on the door once again, even more loudly than before. He then calls out, asking whoever is listening to pass on a message that no one answered him when he came to the house. But he kept his promise. The listeners don't make any motion in response to this. The traveler's words reverberate through the dark, empty house, coming from the only living person around. The phantom listeners hear him jump up onto his horse, and then the sound of the horseshoes on the stone path as the traveler rides away. The silence of the forest quickly returns as the sound of the horse's forceful riding fades away. As he doesn't get any response there, he went back. Now let's talk about its setting. It is set in a forest at night. Clues to the setting are revealed subtly at the beginning of the poem as the traveler arrives. He knocks on a moonlit door, showing both that it is nighttime and that he has arrived at a house. Meanwhile, his horse grazes on the forest's ferny floor, which demonstrates that the house is in a wood and that the area around it has become overgrown. If we look at the theme of this poem, there are several interesting themes in the listeners. These include the unknown and the supernatural, as well as isolation and solitude. This mysterious poem touches on all these themes while more broadly speaking on the strangeness of the world and humankind's inability to fully understand it. The poem itself is unknowable, keeping the reader far from the real identity of the listeners or what they mean. De La Mare creates a creepy landscape, every element of which is seemingly untouched but also deeply strange. The traveler is forced to navigate this world on his own. And we are left with many questions unanswered. After reading this poem, we kept thinking about who was inside, why no one opened the door. This seems quite strange. Now let's have a look at the new words. Chomped. It means munched noisily. Forest ferny floor. It means ground covered with vegetation. Turret means small tower. Smote means to struck upon. Leaf fringed sill means windowsill bordered with creepers. Perplexed means confused. Dwelt means lived. Thronging means crowding. Hearkening means listening. Cropping means grazing. Surged, it means heaved. And plunging means charging. So these are some of the new words that we found in the poem. Hope the meanings are clear to everyone now. Let's have a look at some poetic devices used in the poem. We have alliteration and assonance. Alliteration is repetition of consonant sound and assonance means repetition of vowel sound. De La Mare uses alliteration and assonance to heighten the effect of key moments in the poem. For example, the plethora of O and in the later line F sounds in the first two rhymed lines, knocking on the moonlit door and of the forest ferny floor. Likewise, the S and O sounds of the last they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. The listeners could be said to be a personification of the silence and emptiness of the house or of death. So in a way we can see that silence and emptiness of the house personified. Onomatopoeia. When sounds are spelled out as words, or when words describing sounds actually sound like the sounds they describe. For example, over the cobbles he clattered and clashed. The hissing of the snake and the buzzing of the bee disturbed me. Onomatopoeia words in the poem are chomped, smote, echoing, and plunging. These all are examples of onomatopoeia. Then we also find examples of binary image in the poem. When the poet makes use of two contrasting things or ideas, it is known as binary technique. It is used to give more poetic weightage to the lines that have been written. For example, in the poem, perplexed and still, leaned over and looked into are examples of binary image. I hope you all understood the poem well. Read the text carefully and clear all your doubts whenever you feel like. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.